Welcome to Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and fishing luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, we'll be talking with our special guest, Randy Spencer. Randy is not only a legendary guide, but also a Maine fly fishing legend. Randy Spencer guides fishermen on the Canadian border waters of down East Maine. Randy is an author, a songwriter, a voiceover artist, and a columnist, and is affectionately known as the Singing Maine Guide. Randy has written and published 3 award-winning books. He has recorded the soundtracks for 2 documentary films. Portland Magazine has named Randy as one of the 10 most intriguing people in Maine. Yankee Magazine included him as one of the 25 people you need to meet most. He's been the subject of features on CBS Sunday Morning, Boston Channel 5's Chronicle, The Wall Street Journal, and ESPN2. Randy and his wife Shelley, with their 2 English Springer Spaniels, divide their time between Grand Lake Stream and Holden, Maine. Welcome, Randy.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Randy, it's been quite an honor. You bring quite a legacy. Everyone in the guiding community knows you, and I am just ashamed to say that you and I have never met.
Well, I always say Maine is the biggest small community in the world, so it would be inevitable for it to happen eventually.
I agree completely. So, Randy, just for the audience's sake, just bring us back in time to kind of where you grew up and what brought you to Maine.
Well, I grew up in Manchester, Connecticut, and my family had a camp in Sebago area. So I was brought there from birth all the way through high school and summers, and that, I guess, got into my system enough so that right out of college, I took a job at a wilderness canoe camp in Grand Lake Stream, Maine, and that got me into that area. And so I just, I really became invested in the area, and eventually had a camp there, and eventually moved there, and had a place in the village as well.
How many seasons of guiding in the summer did it take before you decided to try to bridge to winter over there?
Oh, not many. As a matter of fact, I was pretty much wintering over there from the start. I started guiding full-time in the late 90s. I had gone to Eagle Lodge Guiding School, owned and operated by John and Tammy Rogers. And so by the time I started guiding, it was still in the 90s, but I was moving full-time into Grand Lake Stream at that point.
Yeah, and in your earliest trips, what were they like? Were you doing just canoe tours, or were you incorporating fly fishing at that time, or how did it all evolve for you?
Oh, they were full-fledged fishing guiding trips. And, it's like with anyone starting out, you introduce yourself to all of the lodge owners and, try to make yourself as visible and as available as possible. So at the start, that's what I was doing just all the time, and trying to, get my name out there and get bookings.
Yeah, that's actually kind of how I started too. I started working with fly shops rather than lodges, and eventually over time I noticed that people were calling me directly, and I'm sure that probably happened for you as well.
Yeah, that was the transition that I began to make about, I want to say, 4 to 5 years in. And that transition is from a dependent guide, if you will, to an independent guide. And by dependent guide, I mean you are basically waiting for the phone to ring. You're waiting for a lodge owner to call you. They have a client. They need a guide. And that's kind of the way it starts for most people. And it's the way it still is for a lot of people. But I wanted to transition into developing my own clientele. And so by that time, using website promotions of any kind, my columns, advertising. And so I had begun that process about 4 to 5 years in.
Yeah, when I first started guiding, I worked with a local fly shop, and then I hitched my cart to Danny Legier at the Maine Guide Fly Shop. And it was there that I learned about the importance of calling back anyone that's interested in. You have 12 to 24 hours the iron is hot and you have to strike. If you get an inquiry, you've got to try to get that to a booking as fast as possible. Don't you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I was told by them that, oh, no, I called, but my brother's got a wedding, or my son can't do it now, or whatever. But if you get them to book early, then everyone remains committed. And I found that was a key to bridging the gap from being a dependent guide to an independent guide. And I've never heard that term. I love it. I'm going to steal that from you, Randy, if you don't mind.
Well, and these days, I'm trying to do what was done for me. In those earliest years, I did have mentors, and especially one who was from the previous generation of guides. Sonny Sprague was his name, and I went with him, and I learned the ropes from him, saw how it all happened, and that was the way it was done in those days. It was sort of an unspoken journeymanship or apprenticeship, if you will, and so now I'm of that generation. I'm of that age, and we have some new guides coming along. And in my attempts to mentor younger guides, I encourage them to eventually develop their own clientele, because if you're attached to lodges only, then your fortunes are, linked to theirs. It's better in the long run and it's also safer, I think, to build your own business. And that's going to serve you for the future much better than being dependent on a lodge or on lodges.
I agree wholeheartedly, and part of that I've witnessed firsthand is, lodge owners change, lodge managers change, personalities change, and if you're working for them, you have to kind of survive the tide of change. And if you're working for yourself, you don't. You're the master of your own domain with your clients, and some clients you're going to keep because they just really enjoy you alone. So, Randy, what is the guiding season like in Grand Lake Stream area? It's take me from springtime to fall.
Well, the things that change throughout the season from ice out until the end of general law fishing mainly are the target species and the clothing, and maybe the means by which you are chasing whichever quarry it might be. So in our area, in the spring, it tends to be trout and salmon. And it can be either brook trout and landlocked salmon, or lake trout, or togue as we call them, and landlocked salmon. The water is cold. These species are up in the water column near the surface, so you can use fly rods, you can use flies, and it's the most fun that way. And of course, the stream opens April 1st, but the guiding doesn't really get going on the stream until May, and then continues through the first half of June. And then during the heat of summer and kind of family vacation time, the target species switches to smallmouth bass. And a lot of people have learned, a lot of people who used to look down their nose at smallmouth bass because they were, let's say, trout or salmon purists, learned their lesson that this is an amazing game fish. And then things switch back when the lakes turn over and the temperatures cool down, the fish come back up top, and it switches back to salmon and lake trout, although you can continue to catch smallmouth bass in the late season, which is when they are the largest, and they are feeding voraciously because their time is limited, and they know it. When the water temperatures get down below 50, they go into a kind of dormancy, and that's coming quickly in late September. So the fishing can be amazing for smallmouth bass at that time.
Absolutely, and we've had days in the fall for smallmouth fishing here on the west side of Maine where any kind of a small rise in temperature on a cold day can just kick off a feeding frenzy, and that really can turn a day from kind of slow into everything all at once. So, same thing here with fishing Grand Lake Stream area. What's the favorite kind of streamer pattern for that you go to, Randy, when you're out with your clients? If you're going to be casting, retrieving, or trolling, or anything like that, we're talking going back to the trout and the salmon in the spring.
Okay, I had to go through a little bit of a. Am I going to give this up here or not? Well, sure. Why
You
not?
don't have to. You don't have to.
My two favorite flies are the Governor Aiken and the Red Ghost.
Yeah, I like it. I like the Red Ghost a lot. I also like the Governor Aiken. That's a good one. We like the Magog smelt here, and naturally, because of the Rangeley region, everyone wants to fish a gray ghost. So,
and I think the Governor Aiken was a brilliant mimicking of. It's a smelt imitation without equal, in my view.
and do you think that it mimics the smelts that are indigenous to that area, or do you think it's just a broad, successful smelt pattern?
I do, and the smelts that were indigenous to West Grand Lake were rainbow smelts, and they were pin smelts, not the kind of jack smelts that you might see in lakes close to you there in Sebago and Long Lake and Peabody, where I grew up. But then starting later in the 80s, there was a stocking of jack smelts into West Grand Lake. And so now there is a population of jack smelts, but they haven't taken hold to the extent that they're exceeding the pin smelts.
I got it. As I mentioned in the introduction, Randy, you are known as the singing Maine guide. What was the first song you wrote that's connected to guiding? Do you recall?
I sure do. It's easy to recall because one of the old guides in town from that previous generation of guides, while I was working for that canoe camp as an outfitter, made the suggestion to me that there really should be a song about the black flies of Maine. And it just so happened that year, it was the worst outbreak of black flies in something like 25 years. I mean, they just made hash of everybody that year. And so that idea kind of, took hold. And I wrote this song about black flies and released it almost as a joke, but certainly as a novelty song, as in those days on vinyl, a 45 RPM record. And to no one's surprise more than me, this thing went to #1 in northern New England and eastern Canada and certain other pockets in New England states for 6 weeks. And I actually had to go on the road and chase this thing around and play hockey rinks and a lot of strange places. But that was the first song.
Yeah, and we've actually we listened to it and we love it. It's got a great sound, a great beat. Your voice is great on it, and where do the ideas come from? Do you think of the name of a song and then you write it, or do you have something going on the guitar? Tell us about your writing process, because I'm interested to know about that.
Well, a place like Grand Lake Stream is just fertile ground for ideas for songwriting, and I love nothing more than to go to my camp and alone and with a guitar and just let those lyrics and melodies happen. And many times they happen simultaneously for me. But besides the natural beauty and the things along those lines to write about and black flies, it's the people and these colorful, wonderful, unique people. And so a lot of my songs had to do with those kind of subjects.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And kind of related to singing, you do voiceover work, which is really unique for a Maine guide. Tell us about the genesis of that. Did someone reach out to you and say, "Hey, Randy, we really like the sound of your voice. Can you do something for us?" Or was it something that you felt you wanted to pitch on your own?
Well, it happened before guiding. I mean, guiding was a late in life career change for me. I had a whole career in advertising before that. And I mean, I used to commute to Manhattan and produce commercials for corporations and for companies. And in those days, there was a period of time early for 7 years when I was George Plimpton's producer. And he would be, if you remember George Plimpton, he was kind of the guy who did everything. In the book that really brought him out and kind of into fame was called Paper Lion. and he had done everything. He had played a season with the Detroit Lions. He had boxed Archie Moore. He had been all over the world and done so many things, and he became a really sought after spokesperson for many products and many companies. And companies that I was doing work for wanted that voice, wanted George Plimpton. So I would go to New York and produce George on these commercials. And in 7 years, I was able to, whether he knew it or not, use George as a teacher and a mentor. So I was writing jingles all those years, and I began to do the voiceovers on them as well, and then became the spokesperson for a lot of different companies myself. And that continued even after I moved to Grand Lake Stream. One of the first things I did was build a recording studio there, and I kept doing voiceovers for these clients.
I understand you had a studio set up in your place in Grand Lake Stream before you had plumbing.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a testimony to your dedication to your craft, for sure.
With a wife and family, the plumbing wasn't long in coming, believe me.
Absolutely. And, you're such a multifaceted person. Your resume is just decorated. The other thing that you're well known for is your writing. Tell us about some of the titles of your books and just a little bit about which each one of the titles the book is about, based on the title.
Well, by the time the first book, Where Cool Waters Flow, was published, I had been a columnist for at least 12 years. First in a kind of tabloid called the Down East Times, and then started writing for the Northwood Sporting Journal, and was also doing op-eds and freelance work during that time. So I was learning about deadlines and learning about time pressure and the things you have to know if you're going to actually produce and make some kind of a living from your writing. And so then I decided to try to tackle a book and just, stayed after it. And it took 4 years really to write my first book. They're taking less time these days, but I had a lot to learn writing that first book. And it was really a book about my guiding experiences up to that point. By that time, I had been guiding full-time for 12 years. And so there was a lot of great stories. I mean, there's nothing like guiding for meeting the most interesting people you've ever met and for having these one-off experiences that in some cases would seem impossible. But that too is really a fertile area for gathering stories.
I have a little bit to share on that too when it comes to just the memorable clients. As guides, we meet a lot of lawyers and doctors and business people and bankers and everything, but I can tell you that one of the best days I ever had floating a river was with two grave diggers from Trenton, Maine.
Wow.
They were just they were salt of the earth. They wanted to carry the coolers, help load the gear. Mike, what can we do to help? And they were so gracious, and you could tell someone had given them the trip as a gift. And at the end of the day, the guy reaches into his pocket and pulls out an old, worn-out Leatherman tool and tries to give it to me as a tip. And he says, Mike, we don't have any money to give you a tip, but you did such a good job. We wanted to give you something. And I just, no, you guys, you hang on to your Leatherman tool. The pleasure was all mine, and it's really a testimony because I still remember these guys to this day. It's great. So the quilt of who we meet, that makes up who we meet as guys, it's just very, very different from day in to day out.
But the humor in that occurs to me right off the bat, Michael, is if they, were anxious to give you their business cards when they left.
Yeah. No, I didn't want the business card about the gravedigger. No, absolutely. So I think we're actually at a pretty good place to take a short break, Randy, and then we'll come back and we'll take on a couple of other really interesting topics that I know our listeners will enjoy. For this Flyline flashback, we reference the history of fly rod making by Lou Zambello. He writes, During the heyday of whaling in the 17th century, baleen became the material of choice for rod tips because of its lighter weight and flexibility. Baleen is found in the mouths of filter-feeding whales. It wasn't until the mid-1700s that rod makers manufactured a product specifically for fly fishing with limber materials such as ash or willow. Trout rods measured 12 feet, while salmon rods frequently exceeded 17 feet. Americans began building their own rods from greenheart and lancewood imported from Britain. Everything changed when the first bamboo canes arrived from the Far East. The first split cane rods were manufactured in England in 1851 using cane strips glued together, but the results were crude. Bangor, Maine's own Hiram Leonard perfected the technique for building split cane rods and is considered the father of bamboo rods. He invented a machine that beveled the bamboo strip edges to make a more uniformly tapered rod in much less time. He also switched from India's Calcutta cane to China's Tonkin cane, which was more uniform and durable. By 1876, the H. Leonard Rod Company was producing 200 rods a year with only 11 employees. And now let's return to the second part of our show. Well, welcome back, listeners. Again, we're visiting today with Randy Spencer from Grand Lake Stream. And Randy, earlier in the interview and conversation, you were talking about guiding down east, in Grand Lake Stream area, and you were working early in the 90s. Were there any Native American guides still working at that time? And tell me what your earliest memories were.
Right. I just wanted to correct that it was the late 90s when I started guiding full time. And certainly there were still Passamaquoddy guides working with us day in and day out. And that number has diminished over time, but there are still Passamaquoddy guides. And one in particular, one of my best friends that I guide with constantly. And I feel extremely fortunate that that's the case.
Yeah. And how many, if you had to count, how many do you think are still carrying a guide's license today?
Oh, that would be hard to say because a lot of people carry guides licenses and were guiding, but have kind of stepped back either because of age or possibly illness or other issues. It's just as hard to say on the non-native side how many are carrying guides licenses. There are probably something like 30, maybe 33 working guides in Grand Lake Stream. Yeah.
So, amazing. And one more thing I want to ask you about your writing. We talked about your first book. You've had other books as well, and is there anything currently in the works?
The way that works, first I'll go back and you asked about the 3 books. The first one, Where Cool Waters Flow. Guiding experiences up to that point. Second book, Wide and Deep, more personal. For example, attempting to save a life, a drowning fly fisherman in Grand Lake Stream. And then the whole advent of the local land trust and the land management company that they ended up in a relationship with. And that land management company, the old story. Those of us who were leasing camp lots were given an ultimatum. It was basically buy it or lose it. And so that whole history is told in the Wide and Deep book. And also a lot more about the interesting people in the region and experiences. And then the third book, Written on Water, is more about the characters that I am concerned about. We're losing some of our unique characters, and it's sort of not even becoming okay for there to be these really esoteric characters. Too much homogeneity, if you will. And the mysteries, and this is an area full of mysteries, and just to mention the UFO sightings and things that can't be explained, and then the unique characters, and one character whose lifelong ambition was to ride a moose. And so, again, it's really fertile ground for this kind of material, and Written on Water explores that further. and also tries to get into recording some of the rich oral history of the region. So much of these stories and poems are just passed down orally. And I get concerned sometimes that it would be lost in the digital age. And so Written on Water was an attempt to record as much of that as I could.
Very entertaining. And just in hearing you just talk about your books and your interest, Randy, it reminds me that, I never wanted this podcast to be about two white guys talking about how to catch a fish, because I think there's enough of that out there that I actually got the idea to do the podcast by turning off a podcast that was just that, two white guys talking about how to catch a fish. And your books don't sound like, this is how I build my leader, and this is where I fish in the water column, and this is the best fly to use when a rainbow is on the, it sounds to me more like you're interested in the people.
Yeah, I've heard this from readers that my books are just barely about fishing, that they seem to be more, as you say, about the people and about the experiences and the uniqueness of the Canadian border waters where I work, and the people there, the experiences there. So yeah, I guess I have to agree, they're just barely about fishing.
Yeah, and to me, that's, at least for me, that's more entertaining than talking about how to catch fish. Randy, I'd like to jump back. You've made a really interesting comment that needs to be revisited, and that is, you talked about saving a drowning fisherman. Can you kind of give us the story about how that happened and what your involvement was?
Well, it's a difficult story in that it began so innocuously. It was really at the end of a guided fishing day. I had gotten home. I lived practically on the stream itself, Grand Lake Stream. And so I was putting things away and getting ready for the next day, and began to hear something being shouted from the stream. Not unusual. I mean, when someone gets a nice salmon jumping, you'll hear caterwauling and screaming and yelling all the time. But this was just one word shouted, and so I stopped what I was doing and walked a little closer until I could discern what was being shouted, and it was help. And so I just responded, just dropped everything and ran towards the stream to see what was going on. And it was two fly fishermen, one standing behind another in deep water, holding the other man up by his armpits. He had his hands under his armpits and around his chest, and he was holding him up. And this man looked lifeless. And about the same time as I got to the stream, another guy from upstream had heard the same shout, jumped in. We both jumped into the stream and just started running toward these two fellows, and got there at the same time and helped relieve the one fisherman who was holding the man up. And we got this fly fisherman to shore. He was unconscious, and we got him up on the bank and began CPR, and never stopped for 45 minutes, by which time EMTs had been called, and they showed up, and we weren't able to save this man. Since that time, I've learned a lot about it and wrote about it in Wide and Deep, the second book. They were lifelong friends, grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, went to the same high school, joined the service out of high school, went to Vietnam at the same time, got out at the same time, came back to Quincy, and both joined the Quincy Fire Department, and had whole careers, both of them, with the fire department in Quincy, Mass, and retired. And they were fishing buddies all that time, and they always came to Grand Lake Stream, Maine. And that was where Tyke passed away while he was fly fishing Grand Lake Stream. His nickname was Tyke.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Randy.
Quite welcome.
Yeah, so, Randy, the way that I first heard your name was actually in the news, and there was this thing that happened back in the day for our listeners. This was like 15 years ago, Randy, when we had the issue with the warden service. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, wow, a long time ago. Well, next year it will be 20 years.
20 years. Okay, I stand corrected. That tells me how old I'm getting. But the story, I think, made the New York Times. One of my clients from out of state sent me the story back in the day when you'd actually mail each other cutouts of articles and said, "Do you know this guy?" And I didn't, and I started to research you, and I thought, man, this guy is decorated. He's talented, he's well-liked, he's got a long list of clients, and here he is with what appeared to be under arrest. So, I mean, I've got a couple of, I'm just dying to ask you questions because, again, we've never met, and I'm sure that there's a backstory that never got published. Like, as a guide, how did they solicit you? How did that all come about? How did the whole thing start?
You just reminded me when you mentioned the New York Times. Someone found out that you could purchase the negative of the front page of the Wall Street Journal. This is kind of the, in recording, it used to be called the acetate, but it's before it goes to print. And this story was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal with an artist's rendering. And they actually bought this and sent it to me. This front page of the Wall Street Journal covering this crazy story. So, yeah. This was just to maybe give you the time frame and the timing. It was during that period that I mentioned earlier when I was making my transition away from being a dependent guide and working towards becoming an independent guide. So I was beginning to accumulate my own clientele, and bookings were brisk. And, Maine, I mentioned earlier, the biggest small community in the world, and most towns in Maine are population less than 4,000. And there may be things like petty jealousies, that's speculative, but there some kind of a rumor. This is, believe me, after a lot of reflection at the time, in the years following this event, there seemed to have been some kind of a storyline or a rumor that here was this outlaw guide, and it was this poacher, this outlaw guide rumor got going. And I'm not sure how it got going, but I do know that almost any rumor can get legs in a town like that in Maine in no time. And so the velocity with which this rumor got going was just breathtaking. And again, we have the benefit of hindsight now and knowing, how it came down. So the advisory council member at all the regions in Maine, this is Region C we're talking about, have advisory council members that are kind of a liaison between the local fishery and the sport and the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife back in Augusta. And that advisory council member got wind of this story and began to hear from people and listen to this. And at that time we had a local kid, a new game warden. It had been difficult to keep a game warden for very long in that area for a number of years. We had gone through several game wardens in as many years, and they found someone who actually grew up in the area, and the chances are better that that person is going to stay there when that's the case. And so he was the warden of note on the case, but of course he had a lieutenant above him, and then he had the advisory council member. And he was basically doing what he was told, doing their bidding. And this advisory council member took this story, this this hearsay, and amazingly followed through with it. And there was never a question of putting on the brakes and looking into this further, seeing if there might be any validity to it and any evidence at all. And there wasn't. And it's amazing that it did get as far as it did. But it got to the point of the warden service back in Augusta actually sending out an undercover game warden to do a sting.
Yeah, so someone must have contacted you. You know, you don't walk up to Randy Spencer at the boat launch in the morning and say, "Hey, will you take me fishing?" Someone must have gone under a guise or whatnot.
Right.
Is that how it happened?
And they knew by that time, as I was saying, working on building my own clientele, they knew not to go through a lodge, and so it wasn't a phone call from a lodge, but it was a phone call from Vermont, a Vermont phone number, and it was a guy who said he managed a ski area in Vermont, and he kept calling over a period of, I would say, 6 to 8 weeks, because I just didn't have any availability. And finally, one of these times that he called, I had 2 days, and I believe it was in July. And so he grabbed those days, and we set that up, and that we would meet at the general store in town in the morning, and so that's how it began. Funny, it began. His pseudonym it was spelled like the word begin, but it was French, and so it was Bagan, Al Bagan.
Al Bagan, yeah. No, I have a friend named Chris Began, is the way he pronounces it. But, so did you get paid for your 2 days of guiding?
I did, and tipped.
Yeah, right?
And tipped. And tipped rather well. And he caught in 2 days, I know he caught well over 100 smallmouth bass. And, you know, we, in that time, ate 3 fish. And so
right.
here's a good place to mention that, again, if anyone had bothered to put the brakes on and look, it was a classic misreading of the times and the clientele. If I were to comb through my client list, I'm sure that you would tell me the same thing, Michael, as would almost any guide nowadays. You couldn't come up with somebody who would allow you to poach and break the law the way that they were.
No.
You couldn't do it. I mean, there's nobody who's interested in fishing that way or doing that. And that's been true for the longest time. And so it was as if they were acting like it was the 1940s or the 1950s or something like that, because at the end of the 2 days with this undercover agent, he asked me if we could fill up a cooler with fish and set it off on an island and come back and get it later. Like, who's to know? And I can tell you honestly, that is the only time in my guiding career that I've ever been asked such a question, and it was by a game warden.
Yeah, they were trying to push for more, is what they were doing.
Yeah, so it was an 18-month ordeal, 2 trials. During that time, my first grandchild was born. My wife's mother died of colon cancer, and my father died of congestive heart failure during that period. The cost to me to defend myself was $28,000.
Yeah.
And the cost, and you know, the warden service, you know, was the public option, the third payer option. so the taxpayer. So anytime the warden service had to show up in court, they're paid to do so. And a lot of times I think that when charges like this are brought against someone, it's almost a given that someone isn't going to be able to afford to take the time out from their work or to be able to meet an expense like that to defend yourself. But it was the principle involved, and here again, the value of having your own clientele. It was that clientele who did know me and did know my practices and my ethics who raised most of that money.
So really interesting, Randy. At the end of the day, how did they approach you with a violation, and what were they attempting to charge you with?
Well, they were originally trying to show that this storyline about this outlaw guide was true. And so in the process of this undercover agent catching well over 100 fish, and we ate 3 of them, the legal limit per licensed fisherman in those days was 2. It's now 1 smallmouth bass on those bodies of water. But at that time, it was 2 per licensed fisherman, and of a certain size and size limit. And in that time of the summer, a guide many times will fish in order to create commotion around the canoe. As you know, smallmouth are, like any bass species, even striped bass, they respond to turmoil, noise, trouble, as if it might be a feeding frenzy. And more bass come to see what this commotion is. And so I will sometimes fish with something like a devil horse or a jitterbug and just skim it through the water really fast and create splashing and noise, and in that process pick up a fish here and there. Well, I did that, kept one of them. That day he had kept his 2 fish that he was allowed to keep, and so we ate 3 fish. The other day we didn't eat any fish. Well, he came back with, I want to say, egg on his face. I mean, there was no there, and he ended up saying under pressure that the third, I allowed him to take a 3rd fish, which had not been the case. But that's what he said. But he recanted in the second trial. In the end, he was our best witness. I think that it turned out that he was retiring, and this was his last case. And he turned out to be our best witness in the second trial, and my full exoneration came after him telling the judge that that fish really didn't exist. The judge was asking him, well, what happened to this fish? And he said, well, I ate it. So if it sounds like a fiasco, it's because it was. And again, just going forward, we need to all be on the same side. We don't want a warden service that has an us against them culture. This was a dark period in the Maine Warden Service. It's been written about widely. It's been written about in 2 of Paul Dwarian's books and extensively in other venues. It was a big blemish of that and other things that happened during the same time period, and there's no need to go into names or anything, but we just hope that we learned a lot from that and grown from that, and that culture has changed, so that if there were ever such a thing coming up again, we would put the brakes on and examine it more completely and make sure we weren't going on a wild goose chase.
Well, I can say, based on my observation, that the case failed on a lot of levels because, A, they weren't able to prove any legal action against you, and B, your reputation has flourished. You're widely regarded and highly regarded in our community. And it's a testimony to the people that did stand up to your side and say, that's not the Randy Spencer that we know and hire, and sounds like you came out of it smelling like a rose. Randy, being such an experienced guide now, one thing that I'm always interested to talk about, and if there's any other guides that are going to join the audience, I'm sure they would be interested to know, what is the night before like for Randy Spencer on it when a guided trip is about to happen? What's your pre-trip planning like?
It's doing everything exactly the same way every night.
Let's hear it. Give me your list, and then I'm going to have a follow-up question.
Well, in becoming an independent guide, I had to have a partner, and that partner is Shelley, my wife.
Yes.
Of all these years, and now she is the outfitter, and she's the baker, and she's the shopper, and so she puts together the shore lunches, and there's a whole list of Shelley's menu offerings on the website, and the sports choose from that. Shelley's Kitchen, it's called. They choose their one of her offerings, like stout stew or Shelley's fabulous fish cakes, and so on. And she puts that basket together. So,
and how many smallmouth bass do you have to kill to make a fish cake, Randy?
We don't use smallmouth bass. I hear you. No, I hear you. But I will say the price of cod and haddock is really soared. But anyway, so it's a team effort. While I'm doing the breakdown from that day of guiding, which means drying out the runner carpet in the Grand Laker canoe, sponging out the water if there is any, getting the fly rods together, the tackle together, replenishing the gas tank, oil, and so on. And she's doing the basket. And then it's the same thing, as long as you don't vary, because if you added up all the items that there are to remember, it is mind-numbing. And the only way to get that right is to do this same protocol every night and every morning. And then you pretty much are going to be out there with the things you need. It's so easy to forget anything.
I'm the same way. I keep it simple, stupid, as they say, and I've learned over time that if you try to get fancy, you forget the chopsticks, or you forget the special dish you needed to cook the certain thing in, and it's so much easier for me. So out of the meals that Shelley cooks, what's your personal favorite?
It's either Shelley's fabulous fish cakes, or fried chicken. Shelley grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, and learned how to make Southern fried chicken with buttermilk. And it just, when people have her fried chicken, that's what they order the following year.
I love fried chicken, and I think if I get the opportunity to come over and fish with you this summer, which I would like to put out a trip trade with you if you're interested, that may be exactly what I order.
The fish is, by the way, rarely an entree. If a fish or two is kept, it's an hors d'oeuvre before the entree. So most of us guides are cooking a 4-course meal over an open fire every day, and the fish is just an hors d'oeuvre. So to walk you through it, you have pickles and cheese, a fish hors d'oeuvre, an entree, a baked dessert with guide's coffee.
Put me in, Coach. That sounds fantastic. I was trying to figure out how people talk about a fish fry. Well, I mean, I've been on days where you don't catch a fish in the morning just because that happens periodically due to the factors you can't control. But you just answered the question that the fish, if it is going to happen, is really just an appetizer.
Right, and you have at least as many catch and release fishermen nowadays as you do anglers who would like to keep a fish to eat or keep a couple of fish and make a chowder. Now, you mentioned how many smallmouth bass does it take to make fish cakes? Well, smallmouth bass, white perch, almost any fish can make a fish chowder and make a good one. So sometimes fish chowder is an added entree or an hors d'oeuvre. So that's another reason someone might elect to keep a couple of fish within the law.
Yeah, and something that's very different in the state, at least for me, is in Grand Lake Stream, you have really clear water, and it's not industrialized. It never has been, other than maybe a tannery back in the day or something like that. But we can't eat the smallmouth bass in the rivers of the Androscoggin and the Kennebec. So no one would even begin the conversation about killing and eating a bass on the waters that I guide.
Yeah, just a note on our clear waters. There are locals who still drink that water right out of the lake.
That's fantastic. You're lucky to be able to say that, Randy.
And wow, they live a long time. At any given time in Grand Lake Stream, you can talk to a lot of people way up in their 90s.
Yes, yeah, it's a clean living. So I'm going to ask you probably one of the hardest questions, Randy. If you had one day left to fish in Maine, where would you go, and who would you take with you?
Oh, not difficult question at all. I would go, of course, my camp is on West Grand Lake, and I would go to West Grand Lake with my son and my grandson. My grandson is now 6 years old, already fishing, already able to cast a fly line, and already ice fishing as well. So I would want my son and my grandson there.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that, Randy. Something I know that it makes your heart go pitter pat. Is let's talk about your work with the Passamaquoddy History and Preservation Office. Tell me about some of the work that you're doing with them and some of the projects that you have done and you're working with.
Well, that started with the officer who's in charge of history and preservation with the tribe. That's Donald Soctoma, a great author in his own right, by the way, but also a visionary and a grant writer, bar none. And so he was able to write grants and receive funds for projects that would enhance and embrace the Passamaquoddy history and culture. Well, to do that, he wanted to record their traditional music. That was one project. And so we ended up recording 3 albums, one of them with school children doing native music. And one of them was featuring Blanche Soccer Basin and Wayne Newell, both of whom played at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. These tapes and the other projects we did, two documentary films, one of them on the Superfund site that unearthed artifacts dating back 9,000 years.
I think that's in Medibems, is it not?
That's right, Medibems.
Yeah.
And those artifacts lived in the museum in Bar Harbor before going to the Museum of Indian History in Washington, D.C. So those were fun projects as well. But then something that the tribe has always done, and this goes back to Thomas Edison and wax cylinder tapes, is to record the elders late in life, basically telling their life stories. And in this way, they accumulated their oral history, and this was passed down generation after generation. And my job from this particular batch of grants was to take these tapes on, and I had some very, very old tape decks to be even able to play these tapes and then run them through, modern filtering systems and software that cleaned up the transient glitches and the white noise in the background. And in many cases, when I returned these tapes to the tribe, it was the first time they were actually able to hear them. So I've so far digitized 120 hours of these interviews with Passamaquoddy elders, and those tapes have gone to the Museum of Indian History.
Are they accessible to the public?
I think at that museum they're accessible to the public.
Yeah, it's unfortunate in this day and age. Wouldn't it be wonderful to just download an hour that you could listen to? I'm sure at some point they'll probably try to take on that level of technology, but that's great that you were able to work on that. And you were naturally using your production background, I'm assuming.
Right, and my recording studio, and it was hard not to be doing that work, but not stop and listen and be amazed at what you were hearing. For example, there were stories from veterans of World War II and the Korean War, Passamaquoddy tribal veterans who fought for their country, in many cases were grievously wounded, came back to Indian Township and were unable to vote for president in this country. Maine and Utah were the last two states to grant suffrage to Native Americans, and that was in 1953.
And even to this day, they're kind of viewed as outliers to the remainder of the national tribes, and there's a lot of work going on to get them the true recognition right across the nation as they deserve. It's great work you're doing there, Randy. That's awesome. I am just tickled to have had you on the podcast, Randy. I mean, everyone knows you. Everyone loves you. I only wish that we had met before, and I'm going to make a point to try to meet you this summer if you're willing, and what we'll do is we'll try to set up a date. But I'm hoping that after all this, this interview that we had, that our listeners are caterwauling and screaming and shouting. That was your quote from earlier. I love the term caterwauling. What is caterwauling?
Yeah, it's the same as those other words you just mentioned.
Screaming and shouting. I'd never heard it. I learn something every day. That's what life is for. Well, Randy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much.
It means... Yeah, absolutely. And that's what this podcast is about getting people together and familiarizing a broader audience with who these unique and interesting people are that add to the community that we all love and share.
Well, I love the work you're doing, and it's been really nice to meet you.
Thank you very much, Randy.
Take care.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion, and thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones. Flyline Podcast is a product of Riverside FM.
I woke up this morning, I was feeling alright. Stepped outside for a dose of daylight. I thought I was blind, I could not see the sky. Lord have mercy, it was those old black flies. In your hair and in your eyes, black flies. In them old north woods, don't you be surprised when you meet those devils in disguise. I slept and I swatted and I started to run. Lost so much blood I thought I was done. Put on some Raiden 612. Those black flies loved it and took me straight to hell. Black flies in your hair and in your eyes, black flies. In them old north woods, don't you be surprised when you meet those devils in disguise. Now listen here, people, I ain't gonna tell you no lie. There ain't nothing worse than a damn black fly. Behind the knee, even on your thigh. Nothing sacred to an old black fly, black flies. In your hair and in your eyes, black flies. In them old north woods, don't you be surprised when you meet those devils in disguise. I wrote this song in a place called Grand Lake Stream, Maine. The black flies in Grand Lake Stream, Maine eat bull moose for breakfast. They use Route 1 to take off on, I've seen them do that. One fella actually told me he was a black fly taxidermist. When I was there, they were having the worst black fly outbreak they'd had in 25 years. Me being the only out-of-stater in the area, they blamed it all on me. So I wrote this song called Black Flies, and every time we do it, no matter where we do it, I always dedicate this last verse to Delmar Gahagan, to Nigel Dumpster, to Earl Woodcock, to the people of Grand Lake Stream, Maine, to anybody that's ever been bitten by a black fly. Now I'd rather eat worms, marry a hog, share my bed with a mangy old dog. Jungle rot, a good case of the hives, it's a whole lot better than being eaten alive. Black flies in your hair and in your eyes, black flies in them old north woods. Don't you be surprised when you meet those devils in disguise.